Welcome to Collegial Conversations with your host, President of Intent Clinical, Diana Clark.
Hi, and welcome to Collegial Conversations. I am Diana Clark, your host this week, and we have a guest named Benjamin Powers, who is a researcher and educator in the field of neurodiversity, language-based learning differences. He serves as the executive director of the Southport School and founder of the Southport CoLab, where he bridges cutting-edge literacy research with real-world practice for students with dyslexia and ADHD. Dr. Powers is a senior scientist at the Haskins Laboratories and president of the Dyslexia Foundation, a nationally recognized voice on neurodiversity, executive function, and inclusive education. He brings a rare blend of research expertise, practical leadership, personal experience, and insight to the conversation, and a fantastic gleam. If you look him up online, you'll see pictures of him with his eyes just with a wonderful glint in it. So I'm looking forward to talking today. Thanks for joining me, Ben.
Well, Diana, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be part of this experience and to share with everybody some great information and practices. So thanks for having me today.
So you have done the introduction to this book, The Executive Function Blueprint. And when I was looking at it, I realized I may have been using the wrong nomenclature for years. I've talked about executive functioning and not executive function. Is there a difference between those, or is it just that I'm using the wrong lingo?
Well, Diana, you're not using the wrong lingo. In
Okay.
fact, as part of the Dyslexia Foundation, we hosted a biennial research symposium about 2 or 3 years ago on the specific topic of executive function, and just discriminating or deciding on whether is it executive function or is it executive functions with an S. That was about a 2-day debate. So I think part of this is the realization that the research on executive function, although we have decades of research in this area, it's still relatively nascent. And so there's still a debate in the scientific community. We use the term executive function as a standalone concept because our belief, and this is what's in the book, is really this mindset that underneath this umbrella of executive function are these underlying controls, the behavioral, emotional, and cognitive controls. And so we see it as one system, if you will. And that's why we use the term executive function.
Functioning would imply just skills as opposed to the function itself, I guess, right? If
Well,
we
that's
were
right. And I think it's really the dynamic interplay, right, of those behavioral, emotional, and cognitive controls. So it's hard to really kind of isolate them and say, oh, it's just this one piece, where really it's just the design of how all of this is integrated.
okay. So let's start back, roll it back. Just what is executive function? I have
So,
an idea, but I'd love to hear from experts.
well, thanks, Dan. I think, it's funny. A lot of people, when we speak to school communities, parent organizations, when we ask who knows what executive function is, what do you think the most common answer is?
Getting their homework done.
That's exactly right. Getting homework done,
Is that right?
planning and organizing, right? It is rare, although it actually just happened recently at a presentation. It's pretty rare that people really understand what executive function actually is. And the best way to think about it really is it's thinking about those circumstances. Like an example I would give is learning to drive. When we learn to drive, we have to think about all of these different elements, the speed we're going, paying attention to the road. For me, it was kind of staying in between the lines and understanding how to position the car, pedestrians, the rules of the road, all of those things. We need executive function in that moment because it's new. It's something where we have to kind of pull information in that we've known about, apply it in new contexts, and really kind of manage a lot of different pieces. So executive function is really that moment in time where you're encountering something that's new or novel, and you're really trying to work through it, where you have to create a plan and think about what this is going to look like. You're going to have to regulate your emotions as you implement the plan. You're going to have to kind of monitor your progress, have all of these different check-ins, versus something like our daily routine when Many times, especially as adults, we'll say like, "Oh, did we take our medication this morning, or did we set the coffee up last night?" Because those are all rote activities that we just can go on autopilot with. And so, back to that driving analogy, I oftentimes say to audiences, don't raise your hand, but how many of you have ever texted behind the wheel, right? You couldn't do that. No, we shouldn't do that, of course, but you couldn't do that as a brand new driver. You wouldn't be possible, right? Because we need our executive function to really be orchestrating that process versus once we become comfortable and it becomes automatic for us when we reach that level of automaticity, that's really where executive function isn't in play anymore.
So learning a new skill, let's imagine I'm baking bread and I'll use that instead of driving, and I'm learning how to let yeast all of that. It is not second nature. So once something becomes second nature, then our brain goes into a different place. Is that right? The thinking process shifts once it becomes second nature?
Dana, that is a beautiful way to describe it, a very efficient way to describe it too. Exactly right. And that's a great analogy, thinking about the kitchen counter effect. It's one of the analogies I use for working memory, the kitchen counter. If you have a small kitchen counter, you can only put so many things on it. So if you have limited working memory, you can only put so many things in that space. So exactly right. And once you master that recipe and you know how to do it, you can, watch TV, you can be on the phone probably, and the bread would turn out just fine.
Just the same. Yeah, I could knead and watch TV, whereas early on, I had to pay attention, how much flour was I putting in, all of it.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, what role for neurotypical humans does this process of executive function play? What is the role of executive functioning in our lives? To help us learn new skills? Is that the
It can be to learn new skills. It can be to navigate new circumstances, even projects at work or at school. So, it's anything where, there are new elements or we're encountering circumstances that might be a little different. And really, at the end of the day, a big piece of executive function is contributing to our cognitive flexibility. And so, that's really one of the underlying outcomes is that if we have strong executive function, we likely have better cognitive flexibility. And so, um, however, what's interesting is whether somebody is neurotypical or neurodiverse, we all have relative areas of strength and relative areas of deficit within our executive function profile. So when we look at the underlying controls, the behavioral controls, the emotional controls, and the cognitive controls, we all have relative areas of strength and deficit. It just so happens that with individuals with who are at risk for executive dysfunction, people with like ADHD or other learning or attention issues, of course, that that line graph between the strengths and the weaknesses that looks a little bit different.
I bet. I bet. So, what generated initially your interest in this subject? I'm always interested why you have a great passion about the subject. Why?
So, one of the big pieces, Diana, it was funny. I remember, in the maybe the early 2000s, the notion of executive function really started to surface. And I think a lot of people at first thought about it as maybe pseudoscience. And what we know, from brain imaging using tools like fMRI, I mean, without a doubt, executive function is real. And so, what was interesting was looking at a lot of students where, are you familiar with those OXO grips that, like kitchen tools?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen those? Right?
Yes.
They're beautiful, right? They're really well designed. These OXO tools. The reason they exist is because of somebody with a disability.
Hmm.
um, you know, they were invented to make it easier to use kitchen tools for people with physical disabilities like arthritis. So I mentioned that because it's the same case when we're thinking about neurodiverse and neurotypical learners or adults. So what's interesting is in my experience working with neurodiverse children with dyslexia and ADHD, one of the big questions that kept coming up was, well, even with really good research-based instruction, why do some of these students continue to struggle? Why do some of them make gains and thrive, why are some of them less resilient? And one of my colleagues at the Southport School, Jeff Ruggiero, this became a really passionate area of interest for him. And he really dove into executive function. And when he started sharing what he was learning, it was just so engaging and so meaningful that it really pulled me into that work.
Got it. Got it. So when we're thinking about executive function, why is it such a buzzword now? We 20 years ago, you didn't hear about it, but you do hear about it all the time. Either
That's right.
executive functioning is poor, the executive Gen Z has executive function deficits. I read these articles and it keeps coming up in all of the literature. Why?
Yeah, in fact, it's funny you mentioned that. There was a Wall Street Journal headline about a year ago that said, like, the executive function coach is the new must-have.
Right.
The reality is, look, once we know more from research and we're able to name and label something, it's going to gain traction. There's a reality to that. But I think, Diana, actually, the more interesting part of this story are the significant cultural shifts we have all experienced over the last 20 years. And that has made those relative areas of deficit for everybody in the space of executive function um, more visible. And what I mean by that are cross-cutting factors like anxiety. We know, and there's really good data that validates just the significant increase in anxiety and mental health issues. Executive function can be considered like the immune system of the mind in some ways. And so when things like anxiety or other mental health issues become more prevalent, it's going to negatively impact our executive function. So that's one reason. Another reason is that we are just overloaded, right? 30 years ago, Diana, there were like about 10,000 items in the typical grocery store. That's increased 3 to 4 times in the last 30 years, right? The average grocery store, like, and this data is from about 10 years ago, had about 30,000 items in it, right? And so you think about that, right? You think about being in the aisle
The way you have to function, even just grocery shopping, the
is
amount.
overwhelming, right? It's completely overwhelming. And so we're overwhelmed by choice. We're overwhelmed by, social media. We're overwhelmed by email. There's just so much more stimuli happening in our environment than we ever anticipated. And so, or we were ever designed to engage with. And so that is overloading everybody's executive function. And I would suggest that one of the biggest culprits here, besides technology and being overwhelmed and anxiety, I would suggest the biggest culprit is how we are raising our children.
Ooh, tell
Yeah.
me tell me why you think that is the culprit.
Well, unfortunately, we've gone from a place where children were more kind of free range. They would have to be much more independent, not just in kind of day to day responsibilities, but also in things like planning and organizing activities with their friends. I mean, I think about being a kid, I'm 48 now, Diana. When I think about being a kid, it was a huge success just to find your friends, right? Just to like meet
Right,
up in the same place at the same time.
that's right.
Now, most of our children are in highly structured, organized activities. And who's leading those activities? The adults, right? And so, with good intention, we have created so much structure around our children, so many protective factors. And unfortunately, what that's done is it's removed the need for children to develop these executive function skills on their own. And so they don't have that opportunity to encounter those novel situations, to figure out. I mean, even in playgrounds today, there are signs about rules and how to settle disagreements, right? We are structuring things so much for our kids that they don't have the opportunity to develop these skills on their own. And what's fascinating about that to me is at a time, and if you've read that book, The Anxious Generation, which is amazing, at a time when anxiety is just through the roof, we're contributing to the development of that anxiety by not giving our children the opportunity to develop these executive function skills. Because by the time they become truly independent, they don't have the ability to actually navigate life in a way that does not involve stress.
Do you see those 20 somethings kids who, whose parents, what I call overfunction, the more they did, the less the kids did, the less was the new normal, and the parents were expecting their kids to think with an adult brain. And so do you think that these kids who get into their 20s without having learned these skills can learn them? Or that it is yeah,
Well, Dan, it's a great question. It's never too late. I mean,
what I thought.
there's a reality to synaptic pruning, and what I mean by that is, the reality is our brain prunes or trims away the things we don't use over time. But the beautiful part about our brain is that it's plastic. The whole concept of
Wire
neuroplasticity,
together, wire together.
wire together. That's exactly right.
Intentional development of these skills, the brain can shift.
That's exactly right. So while it is always better to do things with children when they are younger, because that firing and wiring together is easier to facilitate, it is never too late. And I can tell you, as somebody, as an adult with ADHD, who struggled in a lot of ways academically and just in life, the types of strategies that we can employ with children and adults, they work. And I have seen that in my own life over time. The kinds of strategies actually that we outline in this book, um, I don't apply them the same way for myself or other adults that I would with kids, but they work because the strategies are metacognitive in nature, because we can change the brain. And that's really a beautiful thing. It's never too late.
Never too late. So, give me just one example of a metacognitive process for a skill, for an activity. Give me some kind of example of something like that. You could go back to driving. What would be the metacognition of that for somebody who's avoiding driving? Let's start there.
That's right. And so it's funny you mentioned that, because when I was teaching my oldest daughter to drive, the thing she had the most difficulty with was backing into a space, right? And so
I get that.
part of that is, leveraging and understanding where you are with these different executive function areas. So these different underlying controls. One of the huge opportunities is really getting kids or adults to understand what those different controls are. So, for example, the ability to self regulate. In that case, with my daughter, the more opportunity we could have to develop the understanding of her need to self regulate so that when she was backing in, she wouldn't become frustrated or upset, that the more she could take ownership of that piece, the better off she was going to be. Now, here's the big piece of this, Diana. This has to come from the individual. We can label it, we can give
I can't
meaning to it,
control somebody else.
but that's right. And so, what we have to help our children or adults figure out is contributing to their ability to understand these pieces and then helping them figure out what is going to work for them. In that case, is it her taking a breath? Is it her opening the door and getting outside so she has like a sensory experience? Is it doing something else that she feels good about and then coming back to it? So there can be a host of different ways to help tackle the situation. But by understanding what's happening underneath the surface, labeling it, naming it, and then figuring out, hey, what strategy is going to work for me? That's how we can create that opportunity for not just metacognition, but change.
I love that approach because I can imagine myself with a 16-year-old, and I'm being honest about my own deficits here. They would have a problem in backing up. I would first start with saying between the lines, okay? I would give the instruction. They already knew that. That only can heighten the issue. And then I would want to get the car parked and do it for them. And I think that's what we have done as parents. When we notice that frustration, when we notice that anxiety, when we notice the deficit of emotional regulation, we step in instead of letting it play out.
That's exactly right.
Okay, I shall change. So, else you think that I should have asked today or would like our audience to know before we close?
Well, the one thing I would say, Diana, is I've been doing this work for almost 30 years now. And yes, a lot of my work has been focused on children who are neurodiverse. Um, but they are like the canary in the coal mine in many ways. And so I think what we've come to learn, whether it's about like the science of reading and literacy or other areas, what works for them often works best for everybody. And so we're at this beautiful moment in time where the more we're learning about executive function, the more we're going to be able to help everybody. And I think the question you asked earlier, is it ever too late? No. In fact, many of the times when we talk about executive function or present to schools or communities, the biggest question afterward I get is a parent saying, what about me? It is never too late. And at the end of the day, there are some really simple things we can do to change the conversation for everybody. It's not rocket science. It's understanding, it's being able to identify, and then it's being able to grow with strategies that we can all employ. So it gives me a lot of hope and optimism about where we can head with everybody. So
I love that. And having read the executive function blueprint, I'm going to hold it up again. I highly recommend it if you have a kid who struggles or don't have a kid who struggles. If you may struggle or you know anybody who needs to have task, motivation, regulation broken down into task-oriented things. Very helpful.
well, thanks so much for having me on the show today, Diana. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate it. And for you listeners or watchers, if you've enjoyed this episode, please like us on the YouTube station, intentclinical.com.